Thank you very much, the organizer, for inviting me to present these recent results we had with NWChem on Intermic, and I am Edoardo Apra. I work at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and let me start first to acknowledge, many people that worked on what I'm going to present. The main accomplices for the work on Intermic are Karol Kowalski in my same group at Pacific Northwest, and Michael Clam at Intel, and then there is a whole series of names of people from different places and areas around the world that contributed to various parts of the talk I'll be dealing next. Okay, as customary for DOE, we needed to acknowledge who gave us the various dollars that and the computer allocations that I used for the results I will be presenting next. And let's move to tell you where I'm from. So you probably know where we are right now. We are here, somewhere here in Seattle along the West Coast. If you cross the Cascade Range, if you go beyond, for example, Mount Rainier, you'll see that there is a dramatical change in scenery. You hit the eastern Washington landscape, and somewhere there, closer to the Oregon border, there is Richland, Washington, where Pacific Northwest is located. And in the mid-90s, there was a user's facility called the Environmental Molecular Science Laboratory that was built. And really, the main task is to deal with the molecular aspects of environmental sciences. And as being a user facility, there were, of course, the more traditional experimental apparatuses. At the same time, there was the construction of a computing center. As a sort of side effect of the computing center, there was also resources allocated to build a computational chemistry software to run on the hardware at the computing center. So this is the project that I've been involved personally for quite a few years, and this is, of course, the topic of my presentation. And I already discussed, we have this big emphasis on molecular science, and we can study various different kinds of molecules, and also we can deal with materials. And being a code that is developed to run on a computing center, of course, the performances are tuned for parallel computers. But another important aspect that we really stress, portability in our code. And of course, once a new hardware is available, we really try to do our best to have good performances on the new hardware. And of course, examples like GPU or Intel Mic is something that we looked at, and I'll talk about it next. And it's used in, of course, not just in Amsoil Computing Center, but in other sites like NERSC. Also, we had a pretty recent fruitful collaboration with Viktor Anisimov at NCSA to make it work more efficiently on blue waters. And we open sourced it around 5 years ago, and this is important to improve our base, both as a user community, also the developers community. Another aspect that I want to point out is that all the developments that we do are not just experimental efforts, but it's something that we release to the users on a sort of yearly basis. So all the results that I'm going to show next is something that, for example, is just available for people to use and download from our website. Another peculiarity of NWChem is that we don't really use much of MPI for parallelization, but we use the global arrays library. And if anybody has any curiosity, this is the website where you can get more information. All right, I'll go quickly now. I have a series of slides that probably are not so interesting for this audience. They're more sort of introductory. There is lots of computational chemistry lingo that might be a bit difficult to understand, but, well, for example, for this slide, Gaussian DFT is the most widely used methods in computational chemistry. It was also awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry around 20 years ago. And it's also for NWChem, it's the most widely used methods. And it's a sort of, well, we have a sort of hierarchy of methods in computational chemistry. There are some that are cheaper but give a certain quality of results, and there are some other methods that are more expensive and in principle they should give you more accuracy. And the nature of the game in our case is to study electronic structure of the molecule and to study the energetics associated with it. So there are some other high accuracy methods, for example, couple cluster that I'll be discussing next during my part to the Intel mic. And as you can see, I've tried to put some of the collaborators that we have for NWChem, and it's an ecosystem that is already pretty active and would like even to make it bigger. Okay, so now I'll simply describe some of the activity that we have going on right now. For example, what I'll be discussing next, are these. It's mostly the Xeon Phi port. I'll mention also what goes on GPU. We have some people that will be working on fault tolerance and some other topics. And we, of course, our background is not really computer science. We are application scientists, and when we work on our code, it's not just a series of, once we, for example, go to a new platform, or sometimes we don't simply adapt the code, but we move to different algorithms or computational methods that might be more suitable to the hardware that we are going to use. All right, so now I'll have a few slides to go through the structure of NWChem. I have to confess that the programming language we use is still good old Fortran, relatively close to Fortran 77. On the other hand, the structure of NWChem is pretty modular, so we have a series of hierarchy of building blocks of NWChem. And so once we deal with some new methods, for example, we really make a heavy reuse of our existing infrastructure, and we are still working on that to make it easier. For example, somebody wants to become a new developer to have this person being able to plug in some new functionalities. All right, so if you're not familiar with the global arrays, you can describe it probably in various ways depending on your background. From my viewpoint as a chemist that develops simulation software, it's a sort of high-level abstraction. It allows me to distribute data among the physical memory available on a system. In computational chemistry, the main quantities are dense matrices like this one. So what happens in the global arrays, from the application, I see these globally allocated matrices. And what the global arrays does, it physically distributes the matrix in chunks on the various memory on the processes that are available in the system. All right, so just to give you an idea, for example, I mentioned that DFT is the most widely used methods in computational chemistry and in NWChem itself. And you can see this is a run that shows some relatively good scaling. Let's focus on this line here. So around, it has some sort of moderate parallel scaling on 5,000. It was a run that I did already quite a few years ago, probably around 3, 4, 5 years ago. But instead, let's move to couple cluster, that is what I'm going to discuss next. In the rest of the talk, again, this calculation is not so recent. We did it by now, it's almost 5 years ago. It was on what was, I think, Jaguar at the time. And as you can see, the parallel scaling of this specific part of the code is pretty good, up to almost the full Oak Ridge machine of the time. And also, being a very floppy intensive kernel, you can also achieve very high flopping tensor rate. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, when I'm going to pass to the Intel mic implementation, I'll be dealing with the same theoretical methods, but with a different implementation that I'll be discussing more in detail next. All right, so this other implementation, it's a computer-generated code that makes use of this tensor contraction engine that you can see as a sort of DSL language. And, well, you know, put it very simply, you start from a sort of these diagrammatic symbolic expressions of your interactions in your chemistry many-body theories. Then it generates a formula, and then at the end of it, a computer code. And, well, in reality, once you get this code, you already have parallelizations constructs. But what we really did in our case in the porting on Intel mic that I'll be discussing, all the various passages we did are sort of, you know, hand-tuned, hand modifications of computer-generated code. Even though in principle, what could see also a framework where also what the work I did could be sort of more automated in this process. Okay, an important aspect of this tensor contraction energy that is relevant for the discussion that I'll have following is that all the data, and because of it also, you know, every loop structure is organized in tiles. So you, at the beginning of your calculation, in your input file, you've defined a sort of tile size. But of course, you know, it has to be sort of optimal for overall memory usage, for, you know, to be cache friendly for the various cache levels you have access to, and so on. All right, so this was an older result with this TC method. Well, using the TC implementation, it was again a couple cluster approach, and you can see even in this case we reached very good parallel scaling. It was again on Oak Ridge Jaguar. All right, so these are a few other slides before we hit the Intel mic port to describe, you know, some other efforts we had in terms of scaling. So, of course, in a large parallels, load balancing could be an issue. So some efforts have been done by Karol Kowalski and Sriram Krishnamurti to have a sort of, you know, more sort of improved load balancing instead of having sort of overall serial execution of one part of the calculation, then the next, and then a third section of these kind of methods. What was done was to, in a sense, merge together all these steps in one, so there was an overall load balancing criteria in place. And as you can see, there was, you know, a very good speed up because of this global task pool. All right, some other examples of you know, improved scaling. This is a more complex methods of the same couple cluster. I'm not going to go through the details. What is in essence is you have you know, an additional level of complexity, like, you know, your calculation becomes one order of magnitude more complex. Well, but the good news is that all these various, you know, sub-calculations are not directly related. So you can spawn all these calculations separately in you know, like in different MPI communicators, and this allows you to get some very good scaling. Yeah, this is again a slide about the same kind of methods that shows you, you know, these scaling that we have reached. All right. Okay, so before the last one to introduce, before going into the proper Intel mic discussion, there has been an implementation of the same CCSDT methods on GPUs. Probably the person that was most responsible for it was Wenjing Ma, and it was written on CUDA, so that the main kernel for these methods was written on CUDA, and we did this benchmark on the Oak Ridge Titan machines. And here you can see the numbers. I reported here the number in the whole time in seconds without using GPU, and by using GPU, so the overall scaling is pretty impressive. You know, it's more than 5x. All right, so now let's go to in the last 10 minutes. Okay, in the last 10 minutes, let's hit the most important part of the talk. So I mentioned already this CCSDT method. This is what we chose for this port, and the reasons are, you know, where in these methods you can really have many opportunities to data reuse, and everybody knows that this is an important aspect because of the PCIe bottleneck in terms of data transfer. At the same time, the floating point, it's a floating point intensive kernel, as I'll show you in one of the slides. It was already used for GPU. What we decided to do was the offload approach and not the native one. And I mean, if you're interested in discussing, I can give you more details. Some of the reasons, for example, you know, it's a similar approach to what we use in the GPU case. Another reason is also that, you know, there is all sorts of preliminary data that needs to be in place before the proper CCSDT calculation is in place, that, you know, it's easier to run on the traditional CPU and then start by offloading the final important part of this CCSDT method. All right, so let's describe what was the main characteristics of the port. We initially used OpenMP 4.0 target offloading features, and, you know, we had a working port, but, you know, there was still you know, plenty of time that was used for communications. What we went next, we had to move to the Intel proprietary directive language Leo, and this is what really allowed us to have the needed flexibility for transferring data. Some other important aspects of the implementation that we didn't change at all what is the GA parallelization that we have in place, because what simply happens to the data that we need to process, they are moved from global memory to the local memory on the CPU, and then the CPU can offload the data to the mic for processing. An important aspect that we had only, you know, relatively small and concentrated changes to the Fortran source. It wasn't an effort like what we did for well, I didn't do, what some other people did for the GPU exercise by rewriting the whole kernel in CUDA language. One thing that I didn't like of our design choices that I had to use the Leo directives, and, you know, it's a proprietary kind of a development tool, and he said in our really one important aspect of our software development is always to use freely available or at least a standard tool that we can reuse for other ports. So, in my what I really hope that OpenMP, OpenACC, whatever tool we are going to get will able to merge all these kind of features that are only, at least for the Intel mic, currently present on Leo. So I could by minimally changes adapt the code I have right now to an emerging standard that is no longer proprietary. So pretty quickly, I already showed you, already bored you enough with what is couple cluster. What couple cluster is it's a method to study the energy, the total energy of a molecule. And in chemistry, we call this correlation energy because we have a sort of standard reference energy that we compute with the Hartree-Fock that is the cheapest and the simplest method. And then the difference of this the correlation energy is the difference between the hypothetical exact energy and this reference Hartree-Fock energy. When you use these CCSDT methods, you have two components. You have singles and doubles excitations, and you can see here at the end of the formula. And then you have the perturbative triples computation, but this is exactly what we are calculating with this, with the runs that I show you. All right, so now let's go into the actual implementation of the code. What we are trying to compute is this matrix element, and I hope you're not going to get lost in this cartoon. The important things that I want to point you out is that this is the output matrix. It's a 6-dimensional matrix, and instead the input are these V and T matrices that are 4-dimensional matrices. This is important for the discussions I'm going to do next. So you can easily see that, of course, the data for these 4-dimensional matrices is going to be much smaller in size compared to these 6-dimensional matrices. And to generate this calculation, of course, you'll have to loop over these 6-dimensional indices. In the structure of the code, you have a sort of external loop on these 6-dimensional matrices, and then inside it, you'll have this parallelization to distribute the task load. All right, so this is the actual code with the Leo directives. And the important aspects that, well, we do this initial memory allocation of device. Of course, these are no cost in terms of communication. When we initialize this output 6-dimensional array on the device, again, this is no cost. And then we start the kernel. Inside the main kernel, what we simply send are these 4-dimensional arrays. And of course, let me be repetitive, are smaller in size than the output 6-dimensional matrices that is done here. And you have seen here, I've drawn a loop. So you have multiple calls where you keep sending these 4D, but instead you don't have to deal with the 6-dimensional output arrays only at the end of this very loop. So this is just to show you how these are the opportunities for data reuse and minimize communications. And it's the flexibility of these Leo directives that allowed us to exploit the data reuse opportunities of these algorithms. Okay, so what I showed here are the actual, kernel where you need to achieve the maximum floating point performance that you would hope for. And I already told you there are these inner 6-dimensional loop. The way we parallelized for the multi-threading on the Intel mic, we collapsed the first 3 loops, and then what we hoped for is that the compiler needs to somewhat vectorize the innermost loop. In reality, what happened that this innermost loop, the typical size is around 20-30 units, so it's not really a big vector length. And to achieve a best performances, what we did was, for example, in some cases where it was possible because of the indexing to collapse 2 loops together by hand, unfortunately, the compiler wasn't doing that automatically. And of course, that gives you a larger vector length. And then another important improvement was done by using this loop count directive, because the compiler was often too optimistic about the loop count. Instead, giving the correct loop count was improving quite a lot performance. Let's move quickly to the real benchmarks, and these are the specs of the Tensor Cascade computer. So you can see, the large. It's more than 3 petaflops, and a large part of the floating point processing power comes from the Xeon Phi. It's important to see that we have 2 8 cores Ivy bridge on each guy, so for a total of 16 core, and then we have not 1 but 2 Xeon Phi cards. All right. Let's move to just before the actual benchmarks. What was the experimental setup? This was the most effective setup we found. So we have 4 ranks that we were communicating to the Xeon Phi card, and 2 ranks are communicating with 1 card and 2 others with another one. And the approach is kind of sliced because each one of these pair of communicating processes is using a different slice of the my card as I'm showing you over here. Instead, we have other 4 ranks that are still doing CPU work and with the multi-threading that is possible from what I showed you before. So in the end, we have also 16 concurrent threads that are doing traditional CPU work. All right, let's move to the performances here. What I'm comparing here, this is a relatively small benchmark. You can see the bottom curve is the one that shows a combination of CPU and Xeon Phi card. So you can see it's the fastest one, and also compared to the red dashed line that is only. Sorry, the dashed one is not the one I would compare now, but it's the dotted one above that is using only Xeon Phi. And so it's important to combine, of course, CPU and Xeon Phi use. And then, as a reference, we have these other older methods that I showed you earlier in the talk. So you can see that this new implementation is more effective. So for now, even a larger benchmark, you can see here that I reported the various components using either Xeon or Xeon CPU, Xeon Phi only, and the combination of CPU and coprocessor. You can see that both the scaling is fairly respectable, and the hybrid approach of using Xeon and Xeon Phi is pretty successful. Okay, with this, I'll leave you to my conclusions, and I thank you for the attention.
Questions? Steve?
Always. So what kind of is your final impression from this about the potential for the use of Phi for NWChem, in going into the future?
Yeah, of course, it's clear that this part of NWChem we chose was, a very good candidate for the implementation of the intermic. It was, relatively easy to do it because we didn't have, big changes to the code and so on. And, unfortunately, for some other parts of the code, we have started to do some work. And, some we can use the offload approach. Some others, probably the native approach is more important, going to be more effective. At the same time, I'm also keeping an eye on what is next for Xeon Phi for K and C. At the same, I don't really want to do too much work that might be relevant to us that architecture comes in terms of both, when I optimized the floating point kernels and also the distribution of the data off to the sorry, not K and C, K and L, and so, unfortunately, lots of the work is, it requires lots of attention from the developer. It doesn't come for free. Even when we optimize the floating point kernels, I'm getting some very good hints from the diagnostic of the compiler. But the compiler often doesn't seem to be able to do on its own what is next. It is telling me, you can rearrange the loops in certain ways. The compiler seems to kind of do it in some circumstances, not in others. So, it might be also that the compiler is, relatively young and it needs some, some time to mature. Like it's every time you get a new hardware, the compiler is not always ready from day one. And so, very still, a little bit of terra incognita for what I'm doing. Mm-hmm.
So you chose a couple clusters, which is fine for smaller molecules. To go up to larger molecules towards the biological types, do you see Mike fitting into that? How easy is it going to be to scale the initial DFT or other types of codes that are used for larger systems?
DFT, in reality, is the method that I'm doing most of my software development over the years. I've done really very little so far on Intel mic in native mode, and initially I wasn't really very impressed by the performances, but that was over a year ago. Maybe it was both a compiler problems and other issues. Right now, I don't see it as promising as I see it for couple cluster. I think I'm almost waiting for a system like NERSCORI, where I can see that the hardware, the Pentium unit that are going to be available on that spin of the Xeon Phi should be much more effective for example, what the DFT does.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you.